to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land and pay our respects to elders past and present, and also extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people listening today. My name is Kerry Wright and I work with the Legal Aid New South Wales Community Legal Education team. I'm joined today by Kate. Kate is a lawyer in the Your Story Disability Legal Support team. Hi, Kate.
Hi, everyone.
As I've already mentioned, Kate and I would like to point out that today's webinar is providing legal information, not individual legal advice. If you have questions after doing the webinar about you or your client's individual circumstances, you can contact Your Story, and we'll provide all the contact details later in the webinar. So we're going to start our webinar by doing a poll question with you all. And our first poll question is coming up on the screen. Have you heard of Your Story Disability Legal Support before? So the answers are yes, yes, and I've referred a client to you, or no, this is my first contact with you. I'm just waiting to see if we've got everyone collecting responses. So I'll close that poll and share the results with everyone. Can you see those, Kate?
I can see that we have 50% saying no, this is the first contact with you, and then 35% saying yes, they've heard of us before, and 15% saying yes, I've referred a client to you. So it's really great to see we've got a bit of a mix of people dialing into the webinar today, and hopefully, you know, the webinar will be useful for everyone who's dialed in, whether they've referred a client before or whether this is the first time they've heard of Your Story, because we'll be covering a lot of information this morning.
Great, thank you. And we'll now do our second poll, which is another quick one with you all. So we just wanted to know if you've assisted a client to share their story with the Disability Royal Commission. So I'll close that poll and share the results so you can see that, Kate.
Okay, so it's almost a complete split. So 43% have assisted a client share their story with the Disability Royal Commission and 57 have not. So again, I think what we're going to be discussing today is ways that people can share their story with the Disability Royal Commission and ways that Your Story can help. So I think it will, you know, there's a lot for everyone to get out of that, whether they've assisted a client before or not. But it's great to see quite a mix of people dialing in.
Definitely, thanks. All right, so we're just catching our slides up with you. So the purpose of today's webinar is to help you better understand the ways a person can safely share their story with the Disability Royal Commission, the type of legal information, assistance and support Your Story Disability Legal Support can provide to people wanting to share their story with the Disability Royal Commission, talk about some common legal problems and questions that Your Story can help with, and also how to refer people with disability, their carers and supporters to Your Story for legal support. Okay, so, and you'll see the phone number up on the slide as well. So Kate, can you tell us a little bit about the Disability Royal Commission?
Yeah, absolutely. So as we've got quite a mix of people here today, it might be a refresher for some of our listeners who are sitting in on the webinar, but I think it's a really important point to start our discussion, and that's looking at what is the Disability Royal Commission. So the formal name of the Disability Royal Commission is the Royal Commission into Violence, Abuse, Neglect and Exploitation of People with Disability. So we'll just call it the Disability Royal Commission going forward, and it is looking into all forms of violence against and abuse, neglect, and exploitation of people with disability. The Disability Royal Commission has defined disability as including any kind of impairment, whether that's existing at birth or acquired through illness, accident, or the aging process, and it includes cognitive impairment, physical, sensory, intellectual, and psychosocial disability. So as we could see from that, the scope of the Royal Commission is very wide, and it's not restricted to looking into actions of any one institution in particular or at any particular area of life for people with disability. So the Disability Royal Commission is scheduled to deliver its final report to the Australian Government by the 29th of April 2022. And that's going to occur after the commissioners have finished talking to people with disabilities and hearing about their experiences. And they will then talk to government about what they think should be done to better protect and support people with disability in Australia. For the Disability Royal Commission to make useful recommendations, it's important that it does hear from people with lived experience of disability. And hearing those experiences and stories will enable the Disability Royal Commission to understand the extent of any problems, to learn more about the context in which any abuse, neglect, exploitation is occurring, to understand the impacts on people with disability, their families, support people, and our community more generally, and to gather information that's really relevant to its investigation. So it's really important that it hears from people with disability and also their families, support people, and carers if they're interested. One thing I did want to note at this point is that the Disability Royal Commission is really focusing on these systemic issues and making systemic recommendations. And it's important to know that it can't resolve individual disputes or award compensation.
Okay. Thanks, Kate. And I see on the slide that there's different ways that people can share their stories with the Disability Royal Commission. And we're going to talk about that in more detail later in the webinar.
Absolutely. Yeah.
All right. So, Kate, you've told us about the Royal Commission. So now do you want to introduce our listeners to Your Story Disability Legal Support?
Yeah, so Your Story Disability Legal Support, which I'll just call Your Story going forward, is a free nationwide legal advice and assistance service for people who are engaging or thinking about engaging with the Disability Royal Commission. So we can provide advice to people with a disability, their carers, friends, family members, supporters, or advocates who are thinking about or want to share a story with the Disability Royal Commission. We are flexible and we provide trauma-informed advice in a way that works for clients. One thing I want to note is that at this point, due to COVID-19, we're not able to offer face-to-face advice sessions with clients, but we are still continuing to provide advice to people over the phone or over online conferencing, such as Skype calls. And we can, in some cases, communicate in writing or email, depending on what works for clients. We can also arrange for interpreters, and that can be both in Auslan or language interpreters. We're also happy for clients to be supported in their appointments if they want to be by disability advocates or just general support people, which could include family members or friends. Your Story is a partnership between National Legal Aid and the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Legal Services. So this means that lawyers from all legal aid commissions and Aboriginal legal services across Australia are delivering Your Story advice. The National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Legal Service is made up of Aboriginal community controlled organisations in each state and territory, and has employed Aboriginal lawyers and community legal educators in some jurisdictions across Australia. So this means that Your Story is a culturally safe place for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to get legal advice about engaging with the Disability Royal Commission. I also just wanted to note that we are a multidisciplinary team, so we do have a social worker employed at Your Story, and the social worker is able to connect clients who are presenting with complex issues or needs, or if they're not already connected with social support, our social worker can provide that level of assistance. And if the client becomes a longer term client, they can provide continued contact if it is necessary.
Okay, thanks very much, Kate. And everyone, you can see the image on the screen. This is an image from our new online storybook about Your Story. And it's going to be up on our website soon. We're just working out the finer details. But yes, that's one of our Your Story lawyers ready to chat to you. We also have a new short 90-second animation about Your Story to show to your clients, and that's going to be up on our website soon too. So we look forward to launching both of those resources very soon. So Kate, can you tell us about what type of support Your Story provides for people who contact you?
Sure. So as I mentioned, we're a flexible service, and Your Story is able to tailor support to clients and their needs. A client might contact us and the advice might involve, one or more of the following types of support. So our lawyers are able to advise clients on safe ways that they're able to engage and share their story with the Disability Royal Commission. We're also able to provide assistance communicating with the Disability Royal Commission if a client requests us to do so and would find that helpful. We can also provide support to clients who are wanting to prepare for a private session in line with the capacity of our service. We can also, in some circumstances, provide assistance in drafting submissions to the Disability Royal Commission, where a client is unable to do so themselves and they've been unable to obtain assistance of a culturally safe or disability advocacy service to help them do that, and they meet our criteria for this level of assistance. And also our staff from the Aboriginal Legal Service intend to assist Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who ask for help to prepare submissions. And we can also provide warm referrals to a number of other support services. So this can include referrals to support people to engage with the Disability Royal Commission. So that might include referrals to disability advocates and also counselling services. We can also refer clients who have been called as witnesses in public hearings to private solicitors to obtain advice and representation in relation to what it means to be a witness and to prepare for that process. And also we can provide referrals to specialist solicitors on any other ancillary issues that might arise in the context of an advice appointment. And that could include advice on discrimination or Centrelink issues or human rights issues that they might have, in addition to seeking advice on engaging with the Disability Royal Commission.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Kate. And I have a question. Is it possible for workers or advocates to call you first before referring a client?
So if an advocate has questions or isn't 100% sure about whether a referral to Your Story is appropriate, the best place to call is our information line, which will be up on one of our other slides later, but that's 1800 77 1800. And when calling that number, an advocate will be able to speak to one of our client information officers who can answer questions about the Disability Royal Commission. They can help an advocate or make referrals to counselling services, and then identify whether the person needs legal advice from Your Story disability legal support. And if they do, they can book the client in for an advice appointment. I think the important thing that I'd like to stress is that if our service is not able to provide advice to the client, we operate on a no wrong door policy. So we will try and refer a client to a service that can assist them. So I think I'd really encourage anyone listening today, if they're not 100% sure if their client does require advice from your story, to give the information line a call, because we will work to work with the advocate to work out what is the best approach going forward.
Great. Thanks very much, Kate. I haven't had any questions from our audience, so we'll keep going. So Kate, we're now going to focus on the ways that people can share their story with the Royal Commission. I can see on the slide there's 4 ways to do that. Can you take us through these?
Yeah, certainly. So there are 4 ways that a person can share their story with the Disability Royal Commission, but I did want to note that that's in non-COVID-19 times, and obviously a lot of our lives have been disrupted by COVID-19. So at the moment, some of the Disability Royal Commission's public-facing activities have been temporarily suspended. This means that right now there's one way that a person can share their story with the Disability Royal Commission, but I'm still going to run through all the 4 ways, and I will just cover what the COVID-19 changes mean for each of these ways that a person can share their story with the Disability Royal Commission. So the first way is to prepare and make a submission to the Disability Royal Commission. And what this means is that a person is either writing, drawing, or recording their voice to cover their story, and then they send that in to the Disability Royal Commission. This can be done using the online submission form, which is available on the Disability Royal Commission webpage. A submission can be shared by email, or a person can call up the Disability Royal Commission and make a submission over the phone, or they can post in documents to the Disability Royal Commission. It's also useful to know that submissions can be made in any language, so a person can write their submissions in the language that they're most comfortable in, and that can be translated by the Disability Royal Commission upon receipt. Another thing I just wanted to note at this point is that we're also running a webinar next week at the same time, which is launching one of our resources which covers some ideas on preparing a submission. So while I've identified that there's no single approach to preparing a submission, and the Royal Commission is open to accepting submissions in lots of different formats, we've collated some lessons and tips to try and make the process less overwhelming and make sure that people think about how to share their story in a way that's safe for them. So for anyone who's wanting more information on submissions, I'd really encourage you to dial into that webinar next week as well, because I think there's a lot that could be taken away from that. And I also just wanted to note that submissions are continuing to be accepted at present, and that's not affected by COVID-19. So that is the way that people can continue to engage with the Disability Royal Commission.
Kate, can I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure.
Someone's just asked if you could clarify whether people could make a submission to the Royal Commission if they've engaged with a formal complaint process related to the same issue they're making a submission about.
So I think that really that you'd probably want to book in for an advice appointment about that, because there are, I guess, a number of complexities that might arise if a person's engaged in a complaint mechanism, if they've made a complaint and they're in the process of negotiating or raising that complaint. And that might be something that a person would want to speak through with a lawyer. Another thing that also might be relevant is if they've signed any legal documents in relation to that complaint process, which might limit the legal documents may say you're not meant to speak about this, and we'd need to discuss with that client ways around that. So that's certainly something that we have been giving advice about, but it really is quite dependent on the circumstances and at what stage the complaint is up to, and yeah, really where they're at in that complaint process.
Okay. And someone else has asked if it's possible to put in more than one submission if you have a number of issues you want to raise.
So a person, and this will be covered a bit in our webinar next week. And that,
Okay.
I mean, what Rachel, my colleague, will be looking at is ways that a person can organize their submissions. So if they're wanting to address, say, problems or that have arisen in a healthcare setting, but also wanting to raise something that's happened in education, I think Rachel will be covering the way that a person can use headings to kind of guide their submissions and structure their submissions. But there is no there's nothing that says a person can't put in two submissions if, say, for example, they want to update the commission if they've put in one submission and they've had something further happen. But there also might be ways that a person could just organise their submission to include their full story in one submission document.
Okay, thanks. I've got a few other questions, but I'll let you move through these because they relate to some of the other things you're going to talk about.
Okay, sure. So the next way that a person can share their story with the Disability Royal Commission is through requesting to have a private session. So a private session is where a person shares their story in person with one or more of the commissioners from the Disability Royal Commission. The Disability Royal Commission cannot promise that everyone who asks for a private session will get one. It will really depend on how many people want to have private sessions and request them. The Disability Royal Commission has temporarily stopped private sessions because of COVID-19, but people can still request a private session at the moment and register their interest to have one in the future. And at the moment, we know that the Disability Royal Commission is still planning for private sessions into the future. So if a person registers, that will help the Disability Royal Commission, I guess, create a forward schedule when these COVID-19 restrictions are maybe eased a bit to then resume face-to-face private sessions. So that's the second way a person can share their story with the Disability Royal Commission. The third way is registering to speak at a community forum. A community forum is a public meeting which is organised by the Disability Royal Commission, and it's designed to be a less formal way that people can share their ideas and stories with the Disability Royal Commission. While it is less formal, a person cannot just go to a community forum and get up and speak. They need to register their interest in speaking at a community forum, and then prior to the forum they'll be contacted by the Disability Royal Commission and told if they are going to be given a spot to speak at that forum. Again, at the moment, community forums have been temporarily suspended because of COVID-19. And the final way...
Oh, can I interrupt, Kate? Sorry, I've got a question
Yes,
about community forums.
sure.
Someone's asked, what measures are being taken to legally protect people if they share or might be at risk of sharing incriminating information, specifically in terms of people with intellectual cognitive disability who might have difficult stories to share and may find it hard to understand the difference between giving evidence and sharing information? Is that something you're going to
Okay.
cover in the next section, or do you want to talk about that now?
I mean, we will be so in the next session. I mean, I'm happy to, I guess, briefly touch on protections that are available, but it is probably something that we might be touching on a bit in some of our other slides.
Mm.
But essentially, if a person has concerns, or if an advocate is working with someone and they're concerned about sharing their story and obtaining certain protections, there are different levels of protections that are available to a person. So that might be a person may be better served, for example, sharing their story in a private session if they have concerns about privacy, rather than getting up and speaking at a community forum, because obviously once a person gets up and speaks at a community forum, they've put their story out in a public space and they're no longer able to control that story. So there are, in a way, less protections available in that respect, whereas you have a lot more, I guess, control over the story if you are sharing it at a private session, or if you've obtained legal advice about ways that you can share your story, maybe through a submission or working out with a lawyer what a safe way for you to share your story is, depending on your circumstances. And that might be you need to get advice about the risks of, if there are concerns about potential retribution or payback or privacy. And they're all a lot of complex issues that really need to be discussed with a lawyer.
And I'm thinking one of the other questions we had, Kate, was how would you advise a whistleblower who wishes to share their story with the Commission, especially those concerned with breaches of confidentiality or non-disclosure agreements?
Well, I mean, that is something we are giving people advice about. And again, it really depends on, with non-disclosure agreements, we would need to have a look at the non-disclosure agreements to look at what the actual terms of the agreement say and what the person has agreed to, and then give them advice about ways that they can engage with the Disability Royal Commission. So that might involve needing to request the Disability Royal Commission to issue a notice to produce to get legal protection to provide information. So we will cover just briefly in our case study what a notice to produce is, but as I've said, every situation is very dependent on the circumstances. And so if a person wants to essentially speak about something they might have seen at work and be considered a whistleblower, they should absolutely call Your Story to get advice and discuss those particular circumstances. And we'll be able to, I guess, guide them through what that is. But we, I guess, want to avoid giving just general legal advice over the webinar today.
For sure.
So I guess the takeaway point is if a person has a non-disclosure agreement or wants to talk about something they've seen at work or is afraid of retribution, they're all key legal issues that we can discuss and give advice on, dependent on their circumstances.
Someone's asked a question about how can a person's identity be protected after the Royal Commission, after June 2022, when they bring out their report. Do you know the answer to that?
It's a bit of a, I guess, complicated question in the sense that there are a few different ways a person can share their story. So one way is they can make an anonymous submission if protecting their identity is a real concern to them. That is one option that is available. They can also mark their submission as confidential. But what we know at the moment is that the Royal Commission intends to keep those submissions confidential until the end of the Royal Commission on the 29th of April 2022. That's when it's scheduled at the moment. And then those submissions will become, I guess, government documents which are subject to freedom of information legislation. And so that then becomes a matter that could be determined by, if someone requested copies of the submissions, that's determined under freedom of information legislation, and the fact that it's marked confidential is something that would be borne in mind. We do know that, or it has been indicated that there may be a change in legislation to try and keep those documents confidential forever, but that legislation is still it hasn't gone through yet. So all we can say is that they will be kept confidential for the duration of the Royal Commission and then are subject to just general freedom of information legislation. So that is
Okay.
why I guess a private session is also a really useful tool for someone who is really concerned about their privacy and identity, because that is that is done in private, and that information is kept private, not published. So
Okay. Well,
yeah,
you've
I
just
mean that's
answered
all.
someone else's question.
Sorry.
Someone else was just saying, are private sessions confidential? So you've just answered their question. Thank you.
Yes, they are. So, I mean, all of these factors are obviously going to be important considerations for any client, and a lot of the time it will depend on their own situation. So it's really useful, I guess, to maybe speak to people, for those people to speak to a Your Story lawyer and work out what's the safest way for them to share their story.
Mm.
Um,
Someone's
and so,
saying, oh, can I just say here, Kate, someone's saying they're thinking that they'll get Your Story to check submissions that they're helping their clients write. And they're saying, can this be done in an appointment setting with the person submitting present? So with the advocate, the person who's the submissions from, and yourself with the lawyer, can the advocates be there with you?
yeah, so we're happy for advocates to be dialed into the appointments that we're doing over the phone or Skype, so long as the client consents to that, their participation in the advice appointment. That's fine.
And someone else has asked whether an advocate for a family member can speak to you without the client there if they're unwell and they have their power of attorney or enduring guardian for that person.
So this is a advocate, or the advocate and
It's a family member. A family member speak to you about their family member making a submission.
yeah, I think we can. I mean, we do often get family members wanting to get advice about sharing their story, and we can certainly cover with the family member what options are available in terms of sharing the story, and we can also talk to that family member about, um, whether at some point in the future they wanted to make an appointment for that person if they are likely to want to speak to a lawyer themselves as well.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll let you keep going on this one. And I think some of the other questions will be answered by some of your other slides coming up. So we'll just keep going.
Okay. Um, so the final way to share a story with the Disability Royal Commission is letting the Disability Royal Commission know that you'd like to share your story at a public hearing. So public hearings have been conducted according to topics. So for example, so far there've been public hearings into health, accommodation and education. And these hearings have been streamed on the Disability Royal Commission's website, and members of the public and also media can attend these public hearings. So the commissioners and solicitors working on the Disability Royal Commission may ask a person questions about their stories at a public hearing. And as I've mentioned, you need to get invited to be a witness at a public hearing. So a person who is invited by the Disability Royal Commission to be a witness at a public hearing can apply to have funding, to have legal representation. And as I mentioned earlier, Your Story can assist a person who's been invited to attend as a witness find that private legal representation. And not everyone who asks to be a witness at the Disability Royal Commission will be invited to be one. Again, that will come down to how many people ask. And at the moment, public hearings have been temporarily suspended due to COVID-19. So I think, as some of those questions really highlight, deciding which option is best for a person and their set of circumstances can be really challenging, and it's going to be really specific to their own circumstances, because some of those questions highlighted that a person's story may have some additional complexities around, their personal safety, their privacy, legal agreements they may or may not have signed, whether they're engaged in a complaint mechanism process. They might have concerns about payback, retribution, or loss of employment. And that's why it will be really important for a person to get legal advice and support from your story if they have those additional complexities. And, we're able to listen to the particular circumstances of a client and support them to decide what's the safest way for them to engage with the Disability Royal Commission and share their story.
Okay. Thanks, Kate. You've already mentioned that the Commission has temporarily stopped public hearings. We've got the note on the slide, and that people can still make submissions. And I've also heard on the radio that the Commission's interested in hearing from people with disabilities about the impact of COVID-19 on their lives and their care. And so can your story assist people who want to share their COVID-19 stories with the Royal Commission?
Yes, so I think you're right, Kerry. The Royal Commission is certainly interested in hearing from people with disability, their carers, family members, or supporters about the impact of COVID-19. And recently, the Disability Royal Commission released an issues paper, which is available on their website, called Emergency Planning and Response. And that issues paper identifies that people with disability can be severely affected by emergencies, which include COVID-19, and they might be at higher risk of experiencing abuse, violence, neglect, and exploitation at these times. And the issues paper also identifies that people with disability may face barriers to accessing quality healthcare during the pandemic. They might have issues around inaccessible communication, clinics and testing, and triage protocols. So I think if people do have stories which relate to neglect, exploitation, abuse, or violence that have arisen from COVID-19, or even any other emergencies, which could include, the recent bushfire crisis, this is something that the Disability Royal Commission has indicated that it's interested in hearing about. And people can contact your story to get advice about how they might share that story in a way that works for them.
Okay, thank you. All right, well, we might move on to our next slide, Kate. So can you tell us now about some of the legal issues that your story lawyers are giving advice to people about?
Yeah, I think we have touched on some of them in the questions that have come up, but one thing I
Yes.
do just want to note is that not everyone who shares their story with the Disability Royal Commission will need legal advice. And if a client or person does contact the Disability Royal Commission and it's recommended that they get legal advice or speak to a Your Story lawyer, it doesn't mean that that person's in trouble. It's just that there might be a variety of reasons that they want to get legal advice, and some of the reasons might be, for example, they might want advice on using the name of an organization or person that is involved in their story. They might want advice on the impact of, non-disclosure clauses or other legal agreements that they've signed that they understand to prevent them from sharing certain aspects of their story. A person might be concerned about payback or retribution or loss of employment if they share their story with the Disability Royal Commission, or they might just have concerns about their safety or privacy if they share their story. They might also be seeking advice about sharing a story that talks about current or past court matters, or sharing their story that discloses something that they did that they should not have done. And a person might also want advice or support to get ready for a private session, or they might want some advice about whether compensation is available for what's happened to them. And, these are just some legal issues. It's not an exhaustive list. We're kind of finding the more people we're giving advice to, this list is obviously becoming broader. And you can see that it's a really broad range of legal questions that can arise when a person's deciding whether they want to share their story with the Disability Royal Commission and how they might do that. And, I think because everyone's story is so different and unique, they can, just get in touch with us for some tailored and specific advice.
Yes, and some of the questions we've got here, Kate, relate to some of those fact sheets you've got on there about naming names on your website.
Sure.
So on the slide there, you can see that we have frequently asked questions page on the website, as well as a number of fact sheets about these issues, which advocates can have a look at before they give you a call. And someone's asked me, did you just mention a website where you can put in feedback to the Commission about COVID-19 issues? Would that be the
No,
Disability Royal Commission website?
the Disability Royal Commission website publishes issues papers, and they have
Oh,
just published an issues paper. It's called, I think, Emergency Planning and Responses, and that issues paper, I guess, identifies that the Royal Commission is inviting people to comment on the impact of COVID-19 and other emergencies on people with disabilities. So people are able to, if they have specific stories around that, make a submission to the Disability Royal Commission addressing that issues paper if they would like to.
okay.
And
And
I
they can
think
find that on the Disability Royal Commission website.
Yeah, that's right. And I think in the information we'll send out after this webinar, it will have the link to the Disability Royal Commission, I think. So they should be able to find that issues paper there.
Okay. Someone's asked a question, if someone decides to make a submission anonymously, is this treated the same as a submission where the person's name is on it?
Well, I mean, it is, yes, I mean, it's received by um, the Royal Commission, and it will be considered, I guess, if a person doesn't put their name to it, um, the difference is that they wouldn't then be contacted in the future if they were to, potentially be a witness at a public hearing. It would just be an anonymous submission that the Disability Royal Commission could look at and consider, but there's no then further follow-up that might arise from that.
And someone asked a question, can an advocate tell a story to the Commission about someone who's since died, passed away?
I think that's could be quite a complex scenario. Again, I think we'd probably want some more information because, how that person has information about that story has probably arisen in the context of their employment. So they should get some advice before sharing that story.
And so someone's asked, they say, I might have missed this earlier, but what consent does your story need for an advocate to talk to you about a client's issues on behalf of the client's behalf?
So we have a consent form that if an advocate was wanting to discuss the matter without the client present, the client would need to sign, and we would want to speak to the client just before receiving that to confirm that they'd signed that and they were happy for us to speak to the advocate about their particular circumstances without the client present.
Okay. And someone's wanting you to explain a notice to produce. Is that going to be covered in our case study that we're about to look at?
Yeah, we will look at notice to produce in the case study, which is, I think, the next slide.
Okay, well, let's have a look at that now. Okay, so while we've outlined some of the common questions and issues a person might want to get legal advice from your story about, we'll now work through a case study which we hope can demonstrate the ways that we can support a client and work with you. If you have any questions as we go through the case study, please feel free to type them in the question box, and I'll ask Kate those questions as you've seen me doing already in the webinar. So Kate, this is Samir. Samir is my client and I'm a disability advocate. Samir has cerebral palsy. Once he visited hospital because he was feeling very sick. He was trying to explain his problem, but found the nurse and doctor weren't trying to understand what he was saying. The nurse and doctor kept asking if he'd been drinking alcohol. He felt very let down and left. He did not receive the treatment he needed. Samir wants to share his story with the Disability Royal Commission. He wants the health system to change and thinks it's important for him to share his story to do this. But he's worried if he does, he might not get good medical treatment in the future as payback. How can your story support Samir, Kate? What would you tell him?
Okay, so based on the information that we have, we can see that Samir has concerns about sharing his story with the Disability Royal Commission because of concerns around privacy and payback. So if he booked an appointment with your story, a lawyer would be able to explain to him, much like we've done this morning, the ways that he can share his story with the Disability Royal Commission and address his particular concerns. So we've seen that there's a number of ways he can share his story with the Disability Royal Commission, and he can make some decisions about how much of his personal information he wants to include when sharing the story. So really the choice is Samir's about how he wants to share his story, but a your story lawyer would be able to help him understand the various options that are available to him. So, for example, the lawyer would be able to explain to Samir that one way he can share his story is through making a submission. And the lawyer would be able to explain to him that there are different ways he can make a submission and the ways that he can protect his privacy if he was going to make a submission. One thing we would discuss with Samir is that if the Royal Commission included information from his submission in a report or recommendations, it would be de-identifying it, so he wouldn't be personally identifiable in those reports. But we could also discuss with him the option of providing his submission anonymously or marking it as confidential. And I think we discussed that a bit earlier as well. And the lawyer would be able to run through with Samir what it means to make an anonymous submission and what it means to mark it as confidential. Another option that Samir could consider and a lawyer would discuss with him is that option of requesting a one-on-one conversation with a commissioner, so at a private session. We would note with Samir that at the moment he can just register for a private session, and we could help him register for a private session if he requested that level of support as well. If after registering for a private session, he was invited to attend, we could offer Samir support from a lawyer at our service to help him prepare and plan for the private session, because they are generally 1 to 2 hours in length. And if a person has a very complicated story, it can be really useful to go into that session with a plan and maybe an outline document to provide to the commissioner if they're unable to cover all the points that they're hoping to get through in that private session. So we'd be able to discuss what support we could provide to Samir in that respect, because there will be some limitations on the support depending on the particular client's circumstances when preparing for a private session. So that would be the first kind of information that would be providing to Samir in that case.
And someone's asked, Kate, could Samir attach supporting documentation to strengthen his submission, for example, his hospital record?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's quite common for people to include a written account of what's happened and then attachments as supporting documents. I guess the thing that we'd be discussing with Samir is, that those documents are obviously his personal medical records, so he might be wanting to mark them as confidential as well, and whether there's any details in there that aren't really relevant for the sharing of his story, and whether he wants to, you know, redact certain parts of that information to protect his privacy or personal information as well.
Mm. And someone's made a note that sometimes people with disabilities encounter issues throughout their lifetime, so it could be hard to document everything, so they could make a summary of those issues over time that they've encountered.
Yeah, and again, I think that's going to be something that Rachel will be covering next week, is how people can, I guess, set out what their story when, yeah, a lot of these problems have gone on for a very long time, and that might be through preparing chronology summary documents, or setting things out under themes as well. So that's something that I think Rachel will be covering, and it is covered in our resource around information of things to include in submissions.
I'm just going to say that it's 5 to 1, so I think we've got about 15 minutes left of our webinar, so hopefully people can stay on, and we can answer your questions as well. And any questions about submissions, we might encourage people to come along next Thursday and participate in that webinar. So thanks, Kate. So can the doctor, nurse or organisation sue Samir if he does name them in his submissions for defamation?
Yeah, so I think the first thing that I just want to note, because this is a concern of many people who come to get advice, is that our service can't provide advice about whether a person will be sued by another party for defamation, because really that depends on decision making by another individual or organisation. But the advice that we do provide and can provide to Samir is how he can reduce the risk of being sued, or how he can reduce the risk of a defamation action being successful against him. So, as I've said on a number of occasions, it's really something that each person needs to come and get advice about, because it really depends on each person's situation and story. But in Samir's case, provided he is recounting the facts of his story as he remembers them, it would be, I think, unlikely that an organisation like a hospital or a nurse or a doctor would be able to successfully sue Samir in defamation if he's sharing those facts that he remembers using the formal Royal Commission processes, so through making a submission or sharing his story at a private session. So he would just need to make sure that if he is naming names and wants to avoid being successfully sued, that he uses those formal Royal Commission processes to share his story, which means that he's not reposting or sharing those details elsewhere, like on social media, because that then is outside the scope of those processes. And another thing is, if Samir was genuinely concerned about being sued in defamation because, let's say, for example, he knows that the doctor he saw has sued someone before, has sued a patient before for defamation, we could talk to him about the ways he could get additional protection from the Royal Commission. And one of those ways, which has come up in, I think, a few of the questions, is through getting what's called a notice to produce. So a notice to produce is a document which would legally compel Samir to provide information to the Disability Royal Commission. So it would provide him with an additional level of protection and make it even more difficult for the other party to sue Samir in defamation. So we could help Samir request a notice to produce and run through the protections that it provides to him, like in an advice appointment. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks, Kate. So how can I support Samir to get support from your story before engaging with the Disability Royal Commission?
So that, I think,
means...
brings us to the next slide, which is how to get help. So the best way to arrange a free legal advice appointment with one of our solicitors is to call that information line, which is on the screen, 1800 77 1800, or use the contact us form on our website. So, and that's www.yourstorydisabilitylegal.org.au. As I've mentioned, we offer initial advice appointments. That's Monday to Friday between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. And if a client wants to, they can have a disability advocate or support person attend the session with them. The other thing that I'd like to point out to everyone is that our website has a lot of really useful fact sheets and frequently asked questions and answers. One of those fact sheets is on notices to produce and the protections that a notice to produce provides a person. We also have fact sheets on naming names, introductory information on Your Story legal support. I do just want to note that they're very general in nature and they're not designed to be a substitute for legal advice, but it can be a really useful tool for disability advocates who might be sitting down with clients thinking about getting legal advice or thinking about engaging with the Disability Royal Commission to have a look at. But as I said, always contact us if you have specific questions arising from that information or in relation to particular circumstances.
Can you just run through again, Kate, if an advocate wants to contact you, the consent that they get from their client, can that be verbal? Does it have to be written? How does that work? Someone's asked about that.
I mean, for a client, for a disability advocate can book in an appointment on behalf of a client, and then they would be able to, if they wanted to participate in the advice session, forward us a copy of any consent that they had, or we could then in the appointment contact the client and confirm over the phone that they were happy for the disability advocate to be dialed into the conversation. Then I guess the consent going forward relates to whether the client gives consent for us to discuss the matter with the disability advocate without the client present. So if the client is happy for us to do that, we have a consent form that we would like the client to sign to allow us to have those discussions with the disability advocate, I guess without the person there, if that's the easiest way to enable communication going forward.
Okay, great, thanks. And I see on the yellow note on the slide that and you've said this already, that if you can't answer the question, you'll find someone who can. So does your story have links with a broad range of organisations across Australia?
Yeah, and that's, I guess, in part because we are a nationwide service. And as I've said, we have a number of solicitors working in different jurisdictions across Australia. So each of those solicitors have good local connections and networks, which enable us to make referrals where appropriate. And we also have a stakeholder manager who's working closely with a broad range of organisations in Australia, including disability advocacy groups, to make sure that we're all working together to deliver, the best service possible.
Excellent. Someone's got a question here about consent. What happens if the client cannot provide informal consent and has no informal support? Is there a mechanism for independent advocates to engage with the Royal Commission on the person's behalf? Is that something they can find on the Disability Royal Commission website?
So a person does not have capacity to give consent? Is that?
It says there they can't provide informal consent and has no informal support. Is there a mechanism for independent advocates to engage with the Royal Commission on their behalf? Oh, that's right. Informal consent was a typo. Oh, okay. So they can't give formal consent and they don't, so they
can't give consent and they don't have capacity to make their own submissions. And so the
yes.
question is, what advocacy is available? I'm not sure. It's something that I'd probably need to look at and get back with that
Yeah.
answer.
Yeah, well, we can follow up from the webinar. We can look at the questions that we've got, and if there's any questions that have been asked in the webinar that we haven't answered, Kate can send you an email and just clarify, provide the information. So we'll look at that. Okay, so all right, so we just go on to our next slide, I think. So Kate, we're nearly at the end of the webinar, and if our audience today could only remember 3 things, what would they be?
So those 3 things we've neatly got up on the slides there, but I think the main points is that Your Story is free, independent advice and support service. We're here to help support clients to safely share their story with the Disability Royal Commission. And I think for people working with people with disability and also their supporters or family members, it's really important, I guess, for them to know that getting advice from a lawyer doesn't mean that they're in legal trouble. We're here to work with them so that they can, safely share their story with the Disability Royal Commission. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. And I see on the yellow note as well, it says that everyone's story is different and may have unique legal issues. And I guess this is another great thing about the Your Story team. As you have workers across Australia, you can draw on a lot of knowledge and skills to help people contacting your service with those unique legal issues. So that's the end of our webinar, and I'll just have a look at whether there's any other questions that people might have. And that is our last slide, which has the phone number on it. So I'll just check these. Other people have noted that it's a big issue for their clients with that they don't have capacity, and also that it might be someone with capacity but they're non-verbal, and the advocate they can't do it face to face. Does Your Story only provide advice around the Royal Commission matters? Does Your Story exist outside of the Royal Commission
So
setting?
I guess to answer that question, Your Story is set up to provide advice about ways that a person can share their story with the Disability Royal Commission. So that's what we're set up to do. And any questions that arise outside of that scope, as we operate on a no wrong door policy, we can make referrals to warm referrals to colleagues where appropriate for those other issues that might, be somewhat interrelated with a person's story that they're hoping to share with the Disability Royal Commission. But our focus is on, we can provide advice about how a person can share their story, and then we provide support to make referrals to other legal services that can address other ancillary legal issues.
Yes, because someone asked whether Your Story can help people who are interested in finding out about the redress scheme that came out of the last Royal Commission.
The I mean, we can certainly make referrals to our colleagues who may be able to provide that advice. I think that would probably be No More Legal Service, which was set up out of the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse. So we can't provide that advice because that isn't about how a person shares their story with the Disability Royal Commission, but we can make a referral if that's useful to a client.
Okay. And someone's asked, is it possible to use video conferencing to have a consultation with a client and Your Story lawyer?
Yeah, so we have been using, I guess, Skype, and we also have, I think, Microsoft Teams. So we're really focused on trying to be as accessible as possible with clients, particularly given how challenging COVID-19 has been. So if there are particular ways that a client wants to interact with Your Story, that's something they can indicate when booking an appointment through our information line, and we'll work to accommodate that.
Okay, great. Someone's asked about a specific Western Australia, where are the lawyers? But I think if you just call the phone number, we can give details of where everyone is located across Australia. Is that right?
Yeah, so I mean, we have a mobile legal team that gives advice across Australia. So as I've said, we can do that over the phone and with video conferencing, and then we also have lawyers based in each jurisdiction. So I think it's best to book in an appointment using the 1-800 number, and we'll work out what works best for the client depending on where they're located.
Okay. Someone's asked about the slides. The slides are on your control panel as a handout. You can download them now. But if you'd like a copy, send us an email and we'll send them out. Someone's noted that people with disability are assisting people with accessing the redress scheme, so that's good to know.
Mm-hmm.
And someone's giving support for the idea of video conferencing. Let me see where else I've got here. Oops, sorry, looks like my slides have disappeared. What else? Someone's asked a question. How does one address issues surrounding receiving information from a client who has memory issues to make a submission on their behalf?
So could you repeat the question, Kerry? Like, how does a disability advocate assist a person with memory issues to make a submission?
Yes, I think that. Not sure if this question now or next week, but how does one address issues around receiving information from a client who has memory issues in order to make a submission on their behalf?
I mean, it may be something that is worth dialing into the next webinar about ways that information can be presented in a submission. But
Yep.
yeah, in terms of how you can get around those memory barriers, I'm not sure if I have the answer to that question today, but
Okay.
I might discuss that with Rachel for
Yeah,
next
and
week
we can
as
address
well.
it. That's right.
Yeah.
Someone's asked if there are alternate ways to make initial contact that aren't via the phone. You've got a form on the website, haven't you, that people can
Yeah,
send
the
to you?
contact us form is available on the Your Story web page. So if a person wants to request a callback or an email, they can do that online.
Okay. All right. Well, that looks like that's all of our questions, Kate. So I think we'll say goodbye to everyone. So thanks everyone for tuning in today. As Kate's mentioned, next week, Thursday, the 14th of May at 12 noon, we have our next Your Story webinar with Rachel talking about ideas for preparing submissions. So we look forward to having you join us then. And if you're not sure how to register, you can go to the Legal Aid New South Wales website and go and look at workshops and webinars, and on the calendar there's a registration link, or send us an email and we'll send you the registration link. Also a reminder that in about an hour you'll get an email from us with lots of links to the things we've been talking about today. You're getting lots of thanks, Kate, from
Oh,
people as
good.
they're signing off.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, so thanks very much, Kate. It's been fantastic. Thanks for all the content in the webinar, but also answering all these questions that people have had. I think you've answered most people's questions. As I say, we'll have a look at those at the end of the webinar after we log off, and we'll email you if we think we can provide some more information other than what we spoke about. So, okay, we'll say goodbye for now.
Great. Thank you.
See you, Kate.
Bye.
Bye.